Our Bible word is Numbers 20, verse 11. Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and the animals drank. Before we continue, let's first have a general overview of the book of Numbers. So let's first look at Numbers. Where does the book of Numbers fit in? Firstly, the name. The name comes from the census lists that appears in the first 4 chapters. And the Greek, it uses the name arithmoi, and that means numbers. And it lists, it's a census, it lists all the fighting men of Israel. So that's where the name comes from. It's those numbers, that census that is listed in chapters 1 to 4. And how does it fit into the grand scheme of things? Of course, it forms part of the Pentateuch, and it means 5 scrolls. Otherwise, it's also known as the 5 books of Moses. It refers to the 5 books of the Old Testament. So if we look at the Pentateuch, it's of course Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And of course, Genesis, that is about the creation of the world and its inhabitants, and also the stories of Israel's patriarchs, their ancestors. The Exodus, of course, that's a story of the plagues and the Exodus out of Egypt and the arrival at Mount Sinai. Leviticus, that depicts the situation of where Israel was camped at Mount Sinai. And that is where the priestly laws were given, and also the holiness code, etc. And then the book of Numbers that we are concerned today, that is where they are still at Mount Sinai, and they then leave for the promised land, and it recounts their desert wandering, and they arrive in Moab. That's the area east of the Jordan River. And Deuteronomy, that's situated to the east of the Jordan River in Moab. And that is where Moses gives the last instructions to the Israelites. So that's how it fits in. So Numbers, it's supposedly begins 13 months after the Exodus. So Israel spent basically a year at Mount Sinai. They're receiving the law and they're erecting the tabernacle. And now Numbers is about, like I said, that census in the first 4 chapters. They must be shaped into like a fighting force. They must be assembled. They must go on the march. And they must go to the promised land. And there they must fight the people that's there. But as things, and that's kind of covers the chapters 1 to 25. It's the first generation of people that left Israel. They are counted. There are about 600,000 fighting men. Of course, it's a greatly inflated number. It can't be historically accurate. But they are assembled. The census is there. There's roughly 600,000 men. And now they must march off to the promised land. And they're there to fight war. But as things turned out, they're very disobedient. They are rebellious. And of course, God punishes them. And they don't make it to the promised land. So chapters 1 to 4, it speaks of the census, these fighting men, and they are go to fight, and up to chapter 25, it ends in disaster because they're disobedient to God. And the next chapters, from chapters 26 to 36, that's now the second generation that's addressed in the book of Numbers. So the first generation has passed away. There's a second census in chapter 26, again of about 600,000 men. And they are now encamped on the east of the Jordan River, and they are also addressed. Now you, and your forebearers, they made mistakes, they're not here. Now it's up to you now to get this right. So there's a second census in chapters 26, and getting the men ready again to go and fight. So chapters 1 to 25 covers the first generation who didn't make it. Then chapters 26 to 36, it covers the second generation and also what happens to them as they are about to enter and conquer the promised land. And of course, because the first generation was so rebellious, they didn't listen to God, it covers a period of 38 years and 10 months where the Israelites wandered through the wilderness. If they were obedient, their march would have been straight to the promised land. But because of their disobedience, now it took them 38 years, 10 months, and the first generation didn't even make it. Now it's the second generation that's being addressed. So that's the biggest story of Numbers. Of course, it also contains various laws that are given to the people. Also, the story of Balaam, that false prophet, and other things, but also how to worship, things about offerings and sacrifices. Chapter 6, it's how to make a Nazirite vow. It wasn't required, but it was done out of your own free will. It was a special dedication to God. That it was also that only temporary. And also part of worship to God was the priests and the high priests, how they must give this what's known as the Aaronic Blessing. So there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that in Numbers. But the biggest story is their journey from Mount Sinai to Moab, east of the Jordan River. That took them over 38 years now because the first generation was so disobedient. So now we're still in the first generation, this rebellious generation who are disobedient to God. But roughly in the 40th year of the Exodus. So this is now towards the end of their time. And now they come to a place called Kadesh. If we go to Numbers 20 verse 1, it says there, then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Of course, Miriam, together with her brother Aaron, earlier on in chapter 12, they rebelled against Moses. So it was also kind of a punishment for her in terms of her disobedience. That yeah, she dies. She doesn't see the promised land. But that's the fate of all Israelites, even Moses, as we'll see later today, because of their rebelliousness against God and disobedience. Now the question is, where is this Kadesh? Is this Kadesh somewhere there in Sinai Peninsula? Or was this Kadesh more in the Transjordan? That's just north of the area of Midian. The wilderness of Zin can refer to anywhere in this area, or maybe that whole area that's there highlighted in yellow. Of course, it's a dry area, extremely hot. It's desert. There's hardly any water. So let's presume that the Kadesh that they were to is there on the east of the map. We also see later in the chapter where Moses sends messengers to the king of Edom that, for permission to pass through the territory. And Edom was more or less this territory as indicated by that brown area. So some will say Kadesh is there and the Sinai Peninsula. Some will say no, Kadesh is there more towards the east, north of the Midian area. Because of course there's these maps, Bible maps, that shows the Exodus and what route they followed. But they're not necessarily trustworthy because scholars, we don't exactly know where these places are that are mentioned. So they're in Kadesh. I think for argument's sake, it's better that it's more to the east, or that one's situated on the east. And now they're there, and now, like they did in the past, the Israelites moan, they complain. I mean, for 40 years, already at the beginning, they complained. At another area, we have no water, it's hot and dry. They complain, we have no meat to eat, please give us meat. And God said, okay, you want meat, I'll give you meat till you're sick of it. And then that happened. And they also rebelled there when they received the 10 Commandments. They made this golden calf, the idol. Jesus also refers to this evil generation, referring to his own contemporaries. But it refers back to this time of the Exodus, also this generation. They're constantly rebelling. They're constantly complaining. They say, we would rather die. We would rather stay in Egypt. Why did you bring us here? This place is really bad. We don't want to be here. And now, towards the end of this first generation's journey, a similar thing happens. If we go to verse 2, it says, now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. Remember, this is a dry place, a very desert place, etc. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, if only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. It refers to previous punishments of people during the Exodus. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. So they complain again. There's no water. This place is dry, hot. We're thirsty. Why you bring us here? So Moses and Aaron, they go to the tent of meeting, and that refers to this mobile temple, this tabernacle that were carried and erected by the Israelites through the wilderness. So they go through the door of the tent of the meeting. They fell on their faces, and then God appeared to them, and God also spoke to them. So God instructed Moses, take your rod and just go and speak to this rock that's in this place. And then the people will have water, and then they will also give water to their animals. So Moses took his rod and he gathered the assembly, but instead of obeying God, Moses maybe he just got fed up with his rebellious people. So he says, here now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses struck the rock. Instead of speaking to the rock, he struck the rock twice with his rod. And then water came out abundantly. So he was disobedient. The people complained, they are disobedient, they were not going to see the promised land. And now because Moses was disobedient, because he struck the rock instead of just speaking to the rock, then God also tells him, well, you shouldn't have done that. Because if you read in verse 12, it says, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. So of course we know at the end of this chapter, it's mentioned that Aaron dies. Later on, when the Israelites are in the land of Moab, Moses can see the promised land, but he can't enter. He dies before they enter the promised land because of this act of disobedience. And it's also mentioned there that now this name, or this place, is also given the name of Meribah. It means a place of strife or a place of quarreling. And the same name was used 40 years earlier. If you go there to Exodus 17, verses 7, there the Israelites also complained, there's no water, give us to drink, etc. And it's that place and this place here at Kadesh is also called Massa. That means testing. So where people contend with God, they quarrel with God, they test God because they do not trust Him. They do not obey Him. They did not listen to what God has instructed. So this is God through Moses giving water, and Moses, the great leader, the prophet, the main prophet of Israel, their deliverer, the one who led them from Egypt. Even he succumbs here to disobedience to God. Because he struck the rock twice, because of this act of disobedience, you couldn't enter the promised land.